Welcome to ECON Empires, where we decode the economic forces that build and quietly destroy nations. Russia went to war to stop Ukraine from becoming subordinate to the West. The result is a paradox few anticipated. Russia itself has become subordinate to the East. This is not an opinion. It is what happens when a country trades economic sovereignty for wartime survival. What we are witnessing is not a battlefield defeat, but a structural transformation. A great power is being absorbed into a larger imperial system, not through invasion, not through occupation, but through dependency so deep that reversal becomes economically impossible. This is how empires fall in the modern era, not with surrender ceremonies, but with contracts, pipelines, currencies, and supply chains. And the numbers tell a story Moscow would rather you not hear. Before February 2022, Russia and China were strategic partners with relatively balanced leverage. Trade flowed in both directions. Energy agreements benefited both sides. Neither country fully dominated the relationship. Moscow had options: Europe, Asia, multiple buyers, multiple currencies. That optionality was the foundation of Russian sovereignty. Then came the invasion of Ukraine. What followed was the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. Markets representing hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade disappeared almost overnight. Technology imports were severed. Financial systems were sealed. Russian banks were isolated, and hundreds of billions in state and private assets were frozen across multiple jurisdictions. Russia did not simply lose access to markets. It lost choice. And when choice disappears, dependency becomes inevitable. Moscow needed a lifeline. Beijing provided one, but not out of solidarity and certainly not out of charity. What China offers Russia today does not resemble partnership. It resembles a carefully calibrated extraction system. Russian crude oil that once commanded premium prices in European markets now flows eastward at deep discounts. Energy analysts estimate reductions ranging between $30 and $50 per barrel below global benchmarks. Natural gas follows the same pattern. When your pipelines point in one direction, and when alternative buyers are legally unreachable, you do not negotiate. You accept. Russia has no leverage, it has necessity. Multiply those discounts across millions of barrels per day over multiple years, and the scale becomes clear. Tens of billions of dollars that should have entered Russian state coffers instead remain in Chinese accounts. A massive transfer of wealth, hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary trade. China is not violating sanctions. It is exploiting them. This is economic gravity at work. Capital, leverage, and choice flow toward the stronger pole. To be fair, Western capitals made a critical miscalculation. They predicted that sanctions would trigger an immediate, catastrophic collapse. That collapse never happened. In fact, the Russian economy has shown remarkable resilience. GDP has grown. Unemployment is at record lows. The shelves in Moscow are not empty. They are full. For the Kremlin, this is framed not as isolation, but as purification. The exit of McDonald's and Starbucks is sold to the public as a victory for cultural sovereignty, a shedding of unwanted Western influence, and a return to traditional values. And, in the short term, the optics work. Life goes on. The ruble exists. The lights are on. But we must ask, why did the collapse not happen? It wasn't because Russia suddenly became self-sufficient. It was because the vacuum left by the West was instantly filled by the East. The resilience is real, but it is not organic. It is imported. Russia survived the Western siege only because China opened the back door. This confirms the thesis rather than disproving it. The fact that Russia is doing better than expected is the ultimate proof of how vital the Chinese lifeline has become. But China is not only buying cheap, it is selling expensive. When Western companies exited the Russian market, Apple, Samsung, McDonald's, IKEA, and hundreds of others, the vacuum could not remain empty. A prolonged collapse in consumer availability would have risked social instability. That gap had to be filled. Chinese manufacturers stepped in with precision. Smartphones, automobiles, appliances, electronics, clothing, everything Russian consumers needed appeared on shelves almost immediately. But nearly all of it came from China. Trade data and market estimates suggest Chinese brands now dominate well over 90% of Russia's smartphone market. The automotive sector tells the same story, with Chinese manufacturers accounting for roughly 70% of new vehicle sales. The exact percentages fluctuate, but the direction is unmistakable. Walk through Moscow or St. Petersburg today and the transformation is visual and immediate. Western logos have vanished. Chinese brands define the retail landscape. This is not diversification, this is replacement. And replacement creates dependency that persists long after sanctions end. Every Chinese smartphone sold builds long-term brand loyalty. Every Chinese car creates permanent demand for Chinese parts, service networks, and software ecosystems. Every appliance familiarizes consumers with Chinese manufacturers and supply chains. Even if Western companies returned tomorrow, they would find markets already captured, distribution channels controlled, and consumer habits reshaped. Re-entry would be slow, costly, and uncertain. Moscow once hoped sanctions would force reindustrialization, that Russian firms would fill the gaps left by Western withdrawal. Instead, Chinese efficiency, scale, and state-backed manufacturing have rendered domestic alternatives economically non-viable. A Russian startup cannot compete with firms serving a domestic market of 1.4 billion people while exporting globally. The capital requirements are too high. The technology gap is too wide. The economies of scale are unreachable. This is not a failure of ambition. It is a failure of structural position. Russia is not industrializing. It is regressing. It is increasingly functioning as a classic extractive economy. Resources are pulled from the ground, sold cheaply to a single buyer, and then re-imported as finished goods at full price. Value-added production happens elsewhere. Technology development happens elsewhere. Manufacturing expertise accumulates elsewhere. Russia provides raw materials. China provides everything else. This is not modernization. This is 21st century economic vassalage. Nowhere is this dependency more irreversible than in finance. Before the war, most Russian international trade settled in dollars or euros. This system allowed flexibility, diversified partnerships, and a degree of monetary autonomy. Sanctions ended that overnight. Cut off from Western financial systems, Russia needed an alternative settlement currency. China offered the yuan. Banking and trade data indicate that the overwhelming majority of Russia-China trade now settles in Chinese currency. This is not a technical detail. It is a structural shift. Russian companies now hold yuan reserves. Russian banks offer yuan-denominated accounts. The Russian central bank must monitor and coordinate currency stability with Beijing. This is not de-dollarization. It is resubordination. Moscow has not escaped monetary dominance. It has replaced one hegemon with another, this time without access to the world's largest consumer market or deepest financial liquidity. As yuan dependency grows, so does vulnerability. Beijing could restrict liquidity, adjust exchange mechanisms, or condition access. Russia would have limited recourse. The dollar is sanctioned. The euro is hostile. Other currencies lack the scale required to absorb Russian trade. Economic sovereignty does not mean rejecting one currency. It means having options. Russia no longer does. A state that cannot control its currency flows, choose its buyers, or produce what it consumes is not fully sovereign, regardless of nuclear arsenals or Security Council seats. These symbols of power become hollow when economic fundamentals dictate outcomes, and the transformation does not stop at Russia's borders. For 3 decades after the Soviet collapse, Central Asia remained within Moscow's gravitational field. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan maintained primary security, economic and political ties with Russia. Russian language dominated. Russian companies invested. Russian political influence shaped outcomes. That era is ending. The CN Summit of 2023 marked a turning point, historians will remember. China's president hosted all 5 Central Asian leaders without Vladimir Putin. The symbolism was unmistakable. What followed confirmed the shift. Tens of billions of dollars in Chinese investment commitments across infrastructure, energy, and industrial development. These are not neutral investments. They are instruments of structural capture. When Tajikistan's debt to China exceeds a quarter of its GDP, Beijing does not merely hold financial claims. It holds policy influence. When Chinese firms build pipelines carrying Turkmen gas, they do not merely construct infrastructure. They control flows. When Chinese capital finances Kazakh industry, it shapes economic futures. China is dismantling Russia's historic leverage point by point. Transport corridors now bypass Russian territory entirely. Rail links connecting China through Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan toward Europe represent more than efficiency. They end Russia's geographic indispensability. For over a century, Russia's position made it the unavoidable bridge between East and West. Chinese infrastructure has rendered that bridge optional. Why transit Russia when alternatives exist? Why pay fees when bypasses are cheaper? Why depend on Russian goodwill when Chinese routes eliminate it? Energy follows the same logic. Central Asian oil and gas once flowed through Russian pipelines to reach global markets, granting Moscow political leverage. China has systematically built alternative pipelines connecting those fields directly to Chinese refineries. The Central Asia-China gas pipeline already carries massive volumes with no Russian involvement. Russia is being removed from its own neighborhood, not by confrontation, but by redundancy. While Russian attention and resources are consumed by a grinding war to the west, Chinese influence expands steadily to the east. Moscow lacks the capital to compete with Chinese investment, the diplomatic bandwidth to counter Chinese initiatives, and the strategic leverage to demand loyalty when better terms are offered elsewhere. Even security relationships are shifting. Organizations once designed as joint frameworks increasingly reflect Chinese priorities. Joint exercises between China and Central Asian militaries occur with growing frequency. Chinese security personnel operate in areas once dominated exclusively by Russian forces. This erosion is quiet, and that is what makes it effective. The pain is compounded by history. Chinese strategic culture operates on timelines that Western analysis often underestimates. The 19th century remains alive in Chinese political memory. During what Beijing calls the Century of Humiliation, Tsarist Russia seized vast territories from a weakened Qing dynasty. Between 1 and 1.5 million square kilometers, changed hands, territory rich in resources and strategic access to the Pacific. China was too weak to resist then. It is not weak now. Those lands remain Russian today, but symbolic reminders occasionally surface. Official maps, subtle signals, and diplomatic gestures suggest that historical memory remains active. Claims do not expire simply because time passes. If China is prepared to challenge the global order over Taiwan, an island it has not controlled since 1949, it is difficult to believe that resource-rich territories lost more recently have vanished from memory. Russian planners understand this risk. Military exercises simulating defense against a potential Chinese incursion into the Far East confirm that Moscow takes the possibility seriously. The demographic reality sharpens the threat. Roughly 6 million Russians inhabit the vast, resource-dense Far East. Across the border live more than 100 million Chinese. Demography creates gravity. Borders and treaties can restrain it, but only temporarily. Current Sino-Russian cooperation manages these tensions through mutual necessity. Both oppose American hegemony. Both benefit from projecting unity against Western pressure. Both gain from economic exchange. But alliances built on shared enemies rather than shared values remain fragile. The relationship functions because Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. And both sides understand this imbalance. Moscow's acceptance of subordinate status is not the result of ignorance. It is a calculated strategic choice. Russian leadership understands the costs. They recognize China's expansion into Central Asia. They understand the vulnerabilities created by Yuan dependency. They see the demographic risks in the Far East. These are not secrets. They are accepted risks, weighed against what Moscow perceives as existential threats from NATO expansion and Western political pressure. Putin's calculus prioritizes regime survival and confrontation with the West over long-term economic autonomy. Subordination to China, while dangerous, does not threaten the current political system. Western reintegration would demand political reform, transparency, and accountability, conditions the present regime views as existentially destabilizing. China offers partnership without political conditions. That distinction matters. This logic explains Russia's enthusiasm for BRICS, despite the bloc's contradictions. In Moscow's narrative, BRICS represents a multipolar future capable of bypassing Western financial dominance. In practice, the reality is more complex. BRICS includes states with divergent interests and competing alignments. Some maintain deep ties with the United States. Others rely on Western investment or security guarantees. Frustration with Western dominance does not automatically translate into unified strategy. For Russia, BRICS functions as diplomatic insulation, a way to claim relevance as its relative power declines. For China, it serves as a platform to expand influence while maintaining the appearance of multilateralism. While Moscow celebrates de-dollarization, the practical result is yuanization. Proposed payment systems rely heavily on Chinese financial infrastructure. Development banks operate with substantial Chinese influence. Power concentrates rather than disperses. China advances its interests. Russia preserves the appearance of status. The asymmetry deepens. The most dangerous aspect of Russia's trajectory lies in path dependency. Infrastructure investments constrain future choices. Once built, they dictate direction. Pipelines cannot be relocated. Gas flowing east cannot be redirected west. Concrete does not negotiate. Consumer habits, financial systems, and industrial supply chains reinforce the same pattern. Each dependency strengthens the next. Breaking free would require resources Russia lacks, time Russia cannot afford, and political will that contradicts regime priorities. Western analysts often debate whether the Sino-Russian partnership is durable. The question misunderstands the situation. Durability is no longer a choice for Russia. China retains options. Russia has eliminated alternatives. With bridges to the west burned, there is only one direction left. This absence of optionality defines modern vassalage. Sovereignty requires the ability to choose. Russia increasingly cannot. When historians calculate the cost of the Ukraine war, they will list battles, casualties, and territorial lines. Economists will record something far more consequential. Russia may secure tactical gains. It may force concessions. It may even formalize territorial control. But the strategic price overwhelms those achievements. To prevent Ukraine from entering Western orbit, Russia entered Chinese orbit. To defend independence from the West, it surrendered independence to the East. To preserve great power status, it accepted junior status. Putin launched this war to restore Russia as an independent pole in a multipolar world. Instead, the conflict accelerated Russia's integration into a Chinese-dominated sphere. The multipolar world is emerging. But Russia occupies a position it did not choose. The Russian eagle once balanced east and west, leveraging autonomy through flexibility. Today, it faces eastward permanently, and what it sees is not an equal partner, but a superior power, controlling its economic lifelines. Russia has not been defeated by armies. It has been absorbed by systems. Pipelines, payment networks, supply chains, and contracts have achieved what force could not. Sovereignty was not seized. It was traded, transaction by transaction, under pressure that felt unavoidable at the time. History will record the war in Ukraine. Economics will record the verdict. A nuclear superpower did not lose its independence to invasion or sanctions. It lost it to desperation and economic gravity. And that is the lesson of econ empires. Nations fall not only through conquest, but through dependence. Not only by force, but through choices that appear rational in isolation and catastrophic in accumulation. Russia made those choices. The bill has arrived. And the currency is sovereignty itself. Thank you for watching Econ Empires. If this analysis changed how you understand modern power, support the channel by liking and sharing. Leave a comment with your perspective on economic vassalage and its implications. Subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Until next time, remember, the most decisive victories and defeats rarely appear on the battlefield, only in the balance sheets.